Hi, I just wanted to welcome you all to the first CSPT Colloquium of the 2013-14 year. We're hoping to, well, we'll be having at least 6 of these between first and more if interest allows. We're going to be presenting a mix of faculty and student work at various levels of development. And the first month will be starting with Peyman Vahabzadeh, which is something I knew I was going to mix up. I'm very sorry about that. He's from Sociology, as many of you will know, and the Director of the CSPT Program. So we thought that we'd start the CSPT Colloquium this year with the new Director giving a talk about his work. So thank you all for coming, and I'll pass it over.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming here. I appreciate your coming here, and I look forward to the future colloquium. So, you know, for this first colloquium, I decided to give you a very hasty overview of what radical phenomenology is, and in terms of its practical, in quotation marks, outcome, what it leads to. So let me just, by way of introduction, say that, you know, if I want to identify a few people who influenced me, I would probably start with Antonio Gramsci, Hannah Arendt, and Rainer Schurman. And of course, as you know, Rainer Schurman is my favorite philosopher. But also, I've been influenced by the works of Jacques Derrida, Ernesto Laclau, and Mahatma Gandhi. That's very important. The reason I mention this is because you will see that, you know, I'm not entirely following the trajectory of phenomenology, but, you know, bring in more of a social and political sensibility to it. So in this sort of talk, I want to give you a sort of quick overview, as I said, of phenomenology, and then kind of pause towards the end or halfway through on sort of present a more careful but condensed, however, right, exposition of radical phenomenology. So let me start with the story of phenomenology. It goes back, of course, to Edmund Husserl's attempt at reinstituting philosophy as universal science. That's a sort of return, if you like, to ancient Greece. The famous phenomenological slogan, towards the things themselves, captures the spirit of bringing phenomena into light beyond value-added, skewed, distorted, if you like, ideological human understanding. Okay? So that slogan basically captures a certain attitude, if you like, of any phenomenologist, and that is intentionality, right? And our thought is always intended towards an object, right? There's no thought as such. There's always a thought of something, right? And this is basically probably the most important component of phenomenology. Husserlian phenomenology, looking back at it, was and has been, is, if you're practicing it today, ego-centered. It is a transcendental phenomenology. However, the works of Edmund Husserl changed from logical investigations, 1901, to ideas, 1913, to the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology, published in 1936, just 2 years before his death. Husserl, through this trajectory, becomes increasingly a structuralist philosopher, and his phenomenology becomes less and less egological or egocentric. Okay, just a note for those interested in sociology. You know that in 1932, the work of Alfred Schutz, The Structures of Life work, came out, and that was the work that was endorsed by Husserl himself, whereas at the same time also works of phenomenological psychology came out in the works of, for example, Aaron Gurevich and so on. And Husserl did not really approve that sort of approach within phenomenology. So it's interesting to see that the first offshoot, basically, of phenomenology into social sciences is actually sociological, because it allows you to look at the structure, right, rather than any specific source of power, etc. Anyways, so we arrive very quickly at Heidegger's engagement here, because at this time Heidegger shows a dissatisfaction with the egological character of phenomenology. So in Being and Time, published in 1927, Heidegger proposes the concept of design, which in German basically means existence, right? But design specifically for Heidegger is the being, for which being is an issue, right? And we don't want to go through this, but the whole structure of anxiety and so on and so forth, care and so on, these are all indicative of design's basically a way of encountering the world. So, in this work, this is basically the first major encounter of Heidegger with the whole tradition, history of philosophy, in fact. Heidegger attempts a destruction or deconstruction, which later becomes actually deconstruction, of entire Western philosophy. By the way, I just need to mention this, that on the lineage of the term deconstruction, which became popularized with Jacques Derrida's work, there is a chapter in Rudolf Gachet's work, The Taming of the Mirror, that shows exactly how this concept of deconstruction goes back to Heidegger, goes back to Husserl. Husserl's concept of abau, which means to also pull apart or deconstruct. Okay, just in case you are interested. So, the deconstructive move on Heidegger's part, however, is not without consequences for his thinking. Soon there is a turning, right, known as Die Kehre, right, in Heidegger. Heidegger rethinks his existential phenomenology or existential philosophy by about early 1930s. This comes out in a book that he wrote in 1934 or 5, if I'm not mistaken, called A Contribution to Philosophy from An Owning, right? Which is basically the German title is Begründung zur Philosophie vom Ereignis. An Ereignis, or event of appropriation, is one of the key later concepts in Heidegger. The book was finished around 1938, but it was published in his centennial birthday in 1989. And it was one of his wishes that this work should not be published during my lifetime. And it was that sort of work of great turning in his thinking. So, in one of the most innovative readings of Heidegger, which involves reading Heidegger backward, the Sorbonne graduate philosopher Rainer Schurman, who was born in 1941 and died in 1993, and was from the New School for Social Research, identified in his book Heidegger and Being and Acting from Principles to Anarchy, 3 mutations or 3 eras, so to speak, in Heidegger's thought. Let me just, before I mention those 3 eras, mention that this book was translated from French. Rainer Schurman was a French writer, and the title of the French book, basically, was altered for reasons unknown to me, but the title is actually, the French title is very accurate about what it is that Schurmanian philosophy does. And the title is Le principe d'anarchie, Heidegger et la question de l'agir, right? Heidegger and the question of age, right? And that is exactly what he does. That's what doesn't come through the English translation. Anyways, the three mutations or three eras in Heidegger are from existential analytic, that would be being and time, to the history of being, that would be the sort of middle career Heidegger, where the concept of design, while retained, sort of loses its, to some extent loses its importance, and it's replaced by the concept of Menschlichkeit, or historical community, historical man. And later, around 1960s and onwards, to the topology of being. And this is basically the Heidegger of Latour seminar in the 1960s, where he actually, in the Latour seminar, he identifies this three period in his thinking, and basically his last word is phenomenology is actually a topology of being, identifying the places in which being appears to us. Okay, but let me just go back to it later. Now, you can observe that what Rainer Schurman does is actually to subject Heidegger's thought to phenomenological method, stepping back. So he actually reads Heidegger phenomenologically, which is a very interesting hermeneutic move, right? Anyways, with this move, phenomenology becomes a temporal character, right? To my knowledge, it was Schurman who proposed the term radical phenomenology. So I imagine that this is his terminology. But he's definitely and certainly welcome.
Sorry, all right.
Sorry to see you. Okay, so to my knowledge, it is the term radical phenomenology is actually from Schurman. I haven't seen, the term anywhere else, at least not as a concept. So we're not just talking about the term, but also the concept. Okay, let me just explain how it works, if I can. So let's go back to the idea of mutations. Okay, there is a mutation, if you like, or there are mutations in our thinking being, right? This is the object of our radical phenomenology, right? But thinking being reveals the way through which being as such appears to us, and that is through reversals. I'll explain what it means. Among the post-Heideggerian philosophers of the 20th century, and I can mention above all German philosopher Werner Marx, Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo, and of course Rainer Schurman. Schurman proposes a compelling reading of Heidegger as the philosopher that actually pointed at to the end of philosophy, right? And the end of philosophy has to be understood properly. The end, right, means that an age has come to an end, an age in which the task of philosophy was actually an affirmation of fundamental grounds, okay, an affirmation of unquestioned principles, and so on and so forth, okay. So this is when Heidegger talks the end of philosophy. At the age when philosophy can no longer sustain, at least without any serious challenges, fundamental grounds, then philosophy is replaced by thinking, right? So, and of course, you are aware of Heidegger's very famous, so to speak, article, right, or lecture, the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, right? So thinking replaces philosophy. Okay. Now, this Heidegger's end of philosophy so brings us to the task of thinking. That in that he and I can add to that we actually, because we are living in the age of irreducible diversity, favor a certain mode of thinking. So this thinking is aware that all the foundational acts are subject to mutations, right? They are from within, riveted by the means of their own subversion, so to speak. All right? And that's actually the thesis in Sherman's last work, Broken Hegemonies. And he goes through history of Western philosophy, shows how a principle rises to dominance, and then it sort of works itself out and has a life cycle and exhausts itself until it's replaced by another epochal principle. Okay, so I mentioned foundational acts. These foundational acts make an epoch in that they make an entire era or period in history intelligible in a certain way rather than other ways. Okay? So the Greek, when they thought of original founding moment, they used the term arche, and arche in Greek basically meant the very first moment when it grows and basically dominates an entire subsequent era. So it's important for us to understand the arche or archic properly. So this is how, in its awareness of mutations, thinking becomes anarchic, right? Anarchic thinking shows itself in various manifestations and terminologies. Nowadays, my favorite term, of course, is, interestingly, Hannah Arendt's description of non-foundational thinking as thinking without banisters. And this is a mode of thinking and judging that does not refer to or rely on assumed measures, pre-given yardsticks, or any pre-given concept. Okay, of course, I imagine, I should be more sure than that, but I imagine that thinking without banisters actually refers to Nietzsche, if I'm not mistaken, when Nietzsche said in Das Spoke Zarathustra, and I quote him, "Have not all handrails," that's banisters, "and footbridges fallen into the water." Right? Okay, so walking through the paths of thinking is always perilous, right? You can always fall, right? But that's the danger of thinking. Okay. So, anyways, now with the question of mutations, we inevitably need to refer to the history of Western humanity as a history of metaphysics, as has been identified by the philosophers of 20th century, especially in Heidegger. Now, on the first page of Being and Time, as you have seen, Heidegger refers to the history of an oblivion of the concept of being, as the focus of metaphysics has been, in fact, the entities, the specific appearances of particular entities, rather than being as such. Okay? So, well, and on that note, I must also mention that this leads, as I'll refer to it, to a fundamental concept in Heidegger, and that's ontological difference. So there's a difference between entities and being, or beings and being, right? These are the terms that nowadays we use. Okay, so the entire history of metaphysics has therefore been the history of oblivion, but also the history of withdrawal. Since, as the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide. Okay, being loves to conceal itself from our being. Okay, in the history of metaphysics, we can identify certain principles that govern over our way of thinking and acting, indeed our way of life. All right. As such, we arrive at the concept of epochs. It is derived from the word epoche. Okay, those who are familiar with phenomenology, epoche is the withdrawal or the withholding or the shelving or the bracketing, all these terms exist, of your judgment at the moment when you encounter a phenomenon. Okay, and that term actually comes from the Greek term echo, which means stoppage or halt. And so that's when you stop your judgments in order for the phenomena appearing before you to appear in its own terms. And this is very important, right? Phenomena appearing in its own terms. Okay? So we understand the epochs in terms of stoppages, if you like. In history, when certain modes of acting and thinking are no longer possible. An epoch opens certain modalities of thinking and acting and forecloses on the others. This is why, for instance, the medievals could not have perceived a farming machinery such as the combine, right? And that is why we cannot possibly conceive of going back to the wooden plow to feed our population. As mentioned, each epoch is founded on an otherwise humble moment of arche. As a first, arche is the first, that founds and gives shape to an entire subsequent era. Arche gives epoch its principles and justifications at the same time, in terms of that which must be thought and done. Okay. An arche gives rise to the epochal principles through the maximization, and that's a key term, the maximization of an originary experience. To think of an epoch as maximization shows the fragile shows the fragile principle within the seemingly unshakable edifice of an epoch, right? So if arche is this really humble, particular origin that suddenly is maximized into, exploited basically into becoming the governing principle of an epoch, right? It exhausts itself in doing that, in stretching itself so thin that at some point it loses energy and collapses, right? And all of this is regardless of human action. This is very important. Humans can act only in accordance with the principles of an epoch, right? Hello. Okay. So, an epoch governs over that which is intelligible and doable within a period of time. When humans act and think in a specific way, an epoch makes specific modes of acting and thinking possible. Hence, the epochal constellations of truth, one of the key concepts that the Schurman's work. We understand an epoch when its sway over acting and thinking becomes weakened. Then we understand that we have been up to this point thinking in a certain fashion, right? But in the aspect or the principle or the governing rule weakening, we actually understand that there has been a governing rule, a principle, or anything like that, right? So, what this means is that an epoch becomes hegemonic, right? To borrow the term from Antonio Gramsci, right? It becomes hegemonic in that it does not dominate us, but actually recruits us, if you like, into believing that this is the way the world, is, and this is the way we should act. We are talking about a law that governs over an environment, right? Economy, right? So economies of presence basically refer to the governing of the way in which things appear to us according to the logic of the epoch within which we live. Okay? So consider Schurman's example of stars as they reappear in different economies of presence. And I quote Rainer Schurman in length here. Stars have one way of being present when Aristotle treats them as divinities towards divinities endowed with reason, soul, and causal efficacy, right? The only intelligibles we can also see. They have another mode of presence when, to the medieval person, they are creatures, each propelled by its angel, and another mode still in the early modern designs of celestial mechanics. Right? So you see like one phenomenon, star, sort of common phenomenon throughout history, has different modes of revelation, if you like. It reveals us differently. And it reveals us always according to the logic dominating that epoch of thinking. So within these economies of presence, there are another key concept, there are ultimate referents that are constituted. Alex Schulman, we identify three epochs within Western metaphysical history, and thus three ultimate referentia of ultimate reference. And I quote Sherman again, sensible substance or nature for Aristotle and the ancients, the Christian God for the medievals, and the cogito, knowing subject, for the moderns. Sherman also says, and this is probably one of my favorite quotes of all times, epochal principles are always ontic givens. Right? So our access to the epochal principle is actually to the object that appears before us in a certain fashion. Right? And that the fashion in which the object appears to us, or the phenomenon appears to us, actually refers us back to the epochal principle. Right? Again, this is a phenomenological method of stepping back. All right? So, that which is present reveals the epochal mode of presentness. It gets a little technical here. As being, again, presences itself. Right? These are sort of various awkward English translations of otherwise interesting German words. Right? So, there is this tripartite modalities, if you like, of being in light of presence. So we can have entities, right? Seiende, beingness, Seinheit, and being, Sein, right? So three modes of appearance of being, if you like, or three concepts of appearances of being. So this observation is, of course, enabled by Heidegger's ontological difference, to which I really briefly alluded to, between being and entities, and also the notion of oblivion. Okay, so as such, we are confronted with the question of thinking in an age of possible transition beyond metaphysics. Possible is key. Let me quote Rainer Schulman when he says, quote, "The task consists then in thinking being as presence, as differing from its economic modalities. This task for thinking will be completed successfully only through a deconstruction of the principles that administer an age. That is where phenomenology, now radicalized, encounters the problem of acting." So I hope you can see how acting not, comes to the fore in terms of philosophical approach to being. Okay, the political, says Schulman, is the domain in which an epoch reveals itself. In fact, an epoch reveals through the political its stamp. Right? That's another one of his terms. He says, Sherman says, that the political is situated in the confluence of words, things, and deeds. How are we to act publicly? How do we participate in the common affairs? Here he asks. The construction of the epochal principles, as mentioned, leads us to a thinking that can no longer secure fictitious foundations. Thinking, therefore, is tied to acting, but not in terms of doing according to a principle or carrying out some prescribed activity. Our time, according to Heidegger, is the time of determining, as I mentioned. This brings us to Rainer Schulman's hypothesis of metaphysical closure. Note the term hypothesis. Right? We cannot have a theory. We can only have hypothesis in this stage. Okay, all knowledge is feigning, right? Because there are no secure grounds for knowledge, right? So, once hegemonic, right? Once hegemony as the epistemic frame of explanation that manifests itself within the world of common sense and everyday experiences loses its grip over the subject, it becomes possible for the subject to break away from the current hegemony and his or her subjectivity framed by it. If we are living, in fact, as the age when metaphysics is possibly withdrawing, is coming to an end, possibly, then there is a possibility for thinking and acting in a post-metaphysical way and beyond the illusion of humanism. This brings me to the distinction between the concepts of agent, subject, and actor. An agent carries out an assigned mission and thus can only act in a teleological fashion. The subject acts according to the principles of an epoch and thus remains hegemonized, while an actor, given the hypothesis of closure, is potentially able to act in a transgressive fashion in light of the possible epochal openings. If with the hypothesis of metaphysical closure, we may be standing at the historical disjuncture when going beyond metaphysics has become possible, then thinking and acting are directed towards showing the withering of the epochal principles. So our thinking and our acting are actually pointing at the way there is a moment of destitution, if you like, in Western metaphysics. Under these conditions, thinking and acting become anarchic, or, in other words, non-founding. In the world of irreducible diversity, then, no secure point of foundation can be found, and no action can be justified by mooring it to a presumably unshakable and secure foundation. Now, we seek openness rather than closure, unfixity rather than fixity, denial rather than affirmation. We relinquish the modern longing for overarching paradigms and totalizing categories, and we acquire concepts as we encounter phenomena in their appearance. We act according to the mode of relating to phenomena. Okay? We allow the phenomena appear to us without all those framings attached to it. So, in living an anarchic way, we need to learn to take phenomena as singulars, instead of making attempts at the maximization of an otherwise singular act or object. Acting in a post-metaphysical fashion enables the actors to also inevitably remain singulars, as opposed to the particulars under modernity, which can be subsumable under fictitious and self-acclaimed universals. We think as we act. Life becomes an ever more complex journey in which decisions are always inevitably provisional. Our thinking and acting become preparatory and transgressive. Thus, action and thought will remain openly and finally attuned to what Rainer Schulman described as the thoughtfulness, and I quote him, as the thoughtfulness of present and future actors. Any other reference here would constitute pure speculation, pure dogmatic construction. So, let me finish by pointing out that in anarchic living, the actors' thoughts are attuned to the very modality of appearance of phenomena. Their action becomes responsive in that they respond to the appearing of a phenomenon instead of subsuming that appearance under imposed categories. Anarchic living involves building rather than founding, suggesting instead of prescribing, interpreting in the place of issuing decrees, persuading instead of imposing. Naturally then, anarchic living celebrates irreducible diversity, and as such, It is a life directed towards reduction of violence in all its institutional, structural, procedural, epistemic, relational, egoistic, linguistic, and hubristic manifestations. And learning to live outside of the ambits of violence is the greatest challenge of our time. Thank you.